Books have always been a cornerstone of American culture. Reading is a pastime much older than baseball, and literacy is more patriotic than apple pie. Purchasing books has been possible through booksellers, of which there have been countless over the centuries. One of the many massive bookstore chains was called Waldenbooks, which was around for nearly 80 years and peaked at over 1,300 stores in all 50 United States. Let's talk about how they got there and what happened to them. The story begins in the early 1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, a period of worldwide economic downturn rivaled only by some of the most notoriously severe financial crises in recorded history. In the United States, the 20s was a decade of great opulence, so suddenly, many of the well-to-do were now homeless and destitute, and that became the national image. Now more than ever, people needed a means of entertainment. Most people read books, which were not cheap to make. Most public libraries allowed people to borrow books for free, but where a lot of these were non-profit, there was a special kind of private library, where customers could rent titles for a nominal fee. These were harder to find, more upscale with rarer and higher quality stock, and more specialty services available to patrons. Two men named Lawrence Hoyt and Melvin Kafka saw a market gap and decided to fill it. They had a mission of giving people the means of low-cost, high-quality reading material. The company was born in Boston in March 1933, on the day that Hoyt walked in on the head of Filene's department store to pitch the concept. They would run a leased book department in their flagship store. When the executive inquired about the name of this new company, Hoyt realized he didn't have one yet. Being a fan of Thoreau's literary classic Walden, and having grown up near the Boston area Walden Pond that served as the book setting, it was suddenly a perfect storm of imagery in his mind. He had no issues coming up with the name right on the spot. The Walden Book Company, he said, and the name stuck. There were two other locations opened in Reed's department store in Bridgeport and G. Fox & Company in Hartford, Connecticut. Hoyt had a history working for Simon & Schuster and was well acquainted with the publishing industry, which gave them an upper hand. Soon there were dozens of locations throughout New England. After World War II, Walden was going on 12 years old, employed around 15 people, and did business inside over 200 department stores. With the 1950s came a cheaper alternative to traditional books, paperbacks. With hardback books, publishers were spending obscene amounts of money in production, but these slimmer books cost pennies to produce and sold for as little as 25 cents a piece. Also, these books were much more accessible for a more overall affluent country, meaning book rental was slated to soon be obsolete. This led Kafka and Hoyt to consider a retail conversion of their libraries, an idea that wouldn't be realized until Kafka would retire. He left Walden in the hands of Hoyt, who would lead the organization at full speed ahead. By the 1960s, their reach had grown throughout several Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. The team restarted talks on alterations that would keep in tune with the changing book industry, and it only made sense to try retail bookselling. They would open a test bookstore in Northway Mall, a new shopping center being built in Greater Pittsburgh. Starting as an addition to an already existing strip center, Northway would be the first indoor shopping mall in Pennsylvania. It would open in August 1962, and the Walden Bookstore would be one of its first tenants. This store marked a big change in company direction. The next year was their 30th anniversary, and they tried to focus on retail growth as competition in the bookselling market became more prevalent. The Dayton Company, which was one of the largest department store companies in the country at this time and just recently launched Target, announced they would enter the bookselling business with the launch of a new chain called B. Dalton Bookseller. With Dayton as a new competitor, Walden would need to grow their retail division faster than expected, and they would eventually ditch book rental altogether. By the end of the decade, company sales had inflated to $4.4 million. This profitability was not lost on the leaders of retail conglomerate Carter Hawley Hale, who were the largest department store operator in the West. They ran several chains, including Neiman Marcus, and they would buy up Walden as well. Lawrence Hoyt would relinquish his position in the company to his son Russell, who would increase the rate of growth to where a new store was being opened every week. Under Carter Hawley, Walden would follow a similar plan to B. Dalton, focusing on mall-based expansion, and began a company-wide name change to Waldenbooks. One of their East Coast contemporaries was Barnes & Noble. They had become the nation's largest wholesale and retail dealer in textbooks, but in recent years had fallen into disrepair. Following a 1971 buyout by a book-savvy young man named Leonard Reggio, they were reorganized. This time, things were different, and the company was now begging for expansion.
Do you have any books on electrical wiring?
Sorry, have you tried Barnes & Noble?
Barnes & Noble. Of course. Of course.
Waldenbooks opened their 500th store in 1978, operating in 44 states. Harry Hoffman would join the company as the next president, and soon Waldenbooks had become the largest bookstore chain in the United States. Waldenbooks also became the first bookstore to link all their computerized cash registers to a centralized warehouse, which gave quicker control over inventory. Regarding their inventory, they received a lot of criticism for focusing on bestsellers and your average blockbuster novels, which sacrificed a platform for more serious works. Hoffman owned it, restating that was exactly the kind of business they were in, and the numbers spoke for themselves. Carter Hawley received an offer from The Limited, who gave a bid to take over the company. They were also being eyed by the General Cinema Corporation. They operated a few hundred theaters throughout the United States, but had stakes in a diverse crew of industries, and they would buy a stake in Carter Hawley, which would grant access to Waldenbooks, the subsidiary they were most interested in. In the 11th hour, Kmart would enter the ring. They had over 2,100 stores across the United States and Canada and did something like $5 billion in sales. They offered $295 million, as well as a $5 million bonus for exclusive access to Waldenbooks, a proposal that couldn't be refused. The Limited said Carter Hawley had just lost its best asset. Regardless, the deal was closed, and Waldenbooks was now a Kmart company. As the third largest bookseller in the country, Barnes & Noble had become quite the operation, with 35 bookstores, shops in more than 100 college campuses, and $225 million in sales. That year, they announced they would buy B. Dalton, who had grown to over 800 stores. This gave Barnes & Noble a boost past Kmart as the largest bookseller in the country. Despite this, Waldenbooks pushed to reach a milestone of 1,000 stores. They would purchase the Brentanos chain, an upscale retailer who'd recently emerged from bankruptcy with 3 stores, and Walden would work to grow these stores massively. Capitalizing on the video game and computer software market, a booming industry at this time, B. Dalton launched Software Etc., selling software in their locations as a store within a store. Walden sold computer software as well, so with a toe in the market already, they started the Walden software chain in June 1987. Walden Kids would come next, a chain that would exclusively sell educational toys and books for children 12 and under. With backing from a big company like Kmart, it became clear that they wouldn't give up the fight for first place. Waldenbooks had broken $1 billion in sales. Under Hoffman, they started the Preferred Reader program, a frequent buyer club that gave points for every purchase made by customers who opted for an annual membership fee. It was the first of its kind and hit 5 million members by the end of 1990. On the other hand, a growing issue was that shopping malls weren't as popular as they used to be. Department stores lost a lot of business, and so did the malls they anchored. During the 1970s, 37 new malls were opening every year, but in the 1980s, this construction dropped to a depressing low of 20 a year. Superstores were more popular, and prime spots weren't popping up like they used to. Being a mall-based retailer, Waldenbooks had to find another means of market domination, and diversification became the answer. Hoffman would dabble in discount in a larger store format, opening Waldenbooks and more. These mini superstores had double the books, a broader product range, and ran about 3 times the size of the average Waldenbooks. At the same time, Barnes & Noble began a superstore initiative. These stores would be massive, featuring cafes, reading nooks, a wide variety of inventory, and children's areas, carrying around 150,000 books. Another superstore bookseller was Borders Books and Music, credited with creating the super bookstore format. They had about 21 stores similar to Barnes & Noble's, and served a higher class of shopper than most others in the industry. They had a revolutionary inventory system so powerful that it could accurately predict what consumers wanted next, envied by much of the industry. Mall-based retail sales accounted for a mere 20% of the bookselling industry, and superstores like those of Barnes & Noble's were taking all the business. Harry Hoffman would retire in 1991 after a dozen-year tenure with Walden. With his know-how, he oversaw the openings of 800 new stores and brought the company to $1 billion revenues. Not all of his ideas were gold, but his fearless aggressiveness did a lot to make Waldenbooks what it was, and his position made him one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. When he left, the company he was integral in shaping headed sky high, despite low profit margins. When Charles Cumello came along, he saw a company that needed to get back to basics, and that it was necessary to scale back sidelines such as toys, games, and movies. This movement went over big, and set a new trajectory for the company. By downsizing, they were able to introduce their own superstore called Bassett Bookshops. In 1992, Kmart announced that they would purchase Borders. The fact that they dealt with a different social class than a lot of Kmart's customers were in raised concerns. Regardless, Borders and Kmart had mutual needs. Borders wanted to be a national bookseller and grow their fleet in a major way. Kmart wanted a bigger foothold and more relevance in the bookselling industry, and they had all the money and real estate to make both their dreams a reality. Kmart's numbers had gone big after strategic acquisitions from OfficeMax, Builders Square, and Sports Authority. The book industry was unique in that it had exponential growth that didn't seem to stop. As people age, they read more. Just about when these booksellers were cropping up, initiatives for more literacy were becoming more popular nationwide. For stores like Walden, sales were still slow, despite this profitability. Kmart would merge Waldenbooks with Borders to create the Borders-Walden group, partly hoping that a merger would help lift Waldenbooks out of its current funk. What actually happened was a mass exit of Borders executives, leaving Kmart in a similar situation as before, with no growth plan and way more responsibility. Through '95, Walden made further moves to downsize and closed over 180 underperforming stores. That year, Borders divorced itself from Kmart, taking Waldenbooks with it. The spun-off company was named simply Borders Group, and soon became a wholly independent entity. As far as Borders Group was concerned, Waldenbooks shrinking was a good thing. By continuing to close more of their locations, they stayed lucrative enough to fund Borders' superstore expansion. This transfer of power became the company's main drive. There were a few problems right off the bat. One was that Borders' music sales were all in CDs, and they weren't as worried about digital as they should have been. Barnes & Noble was playing a market at least 10 years into the future, and put a lot into online and digital, and it paid off in a big way. They announced a website and a bookselling collaboration with AOL. All of this was well timed to compete with newcomer Amazon, which started 2 years earlier as an online book retailer, and would become a major threat to the current industry. Another problem was that Borders was losing value quickly, and projections weren't any better. Following Cumello, the company went through 4 different CEOs, none of which had any bookselling experience. By 2000, Borders were working on how to turn the ship around. Merrill Lynch was brought in, and serious talks of buyouts or further mergers were on the table. Borders.com, which went up in '98, failed to meet expectations, and had become a money pit. They struck a deal to contract it out to Amazon, where they would instead feature their competitors' books and music selection. Conceding Borders.com to Amazon would quickly prove to be a fatal mistake, as Amazon didn't show as much interest to promote Borders as they did take the free exposure. This partnership would end after 5 years. The store deficit continued to shift. The main issue was that the Waldenbooks name had been cheapened and was unimportant compared to Borders. It remained the group's easy cash cow. After the company cut ties with Amazon in 2006, the Borders website was set back by over half a decade. Coincidentally, 2006 was the last year Borders turned a profit. In 2008, the Great Recession would strike them hard and left the group with serious debts to vendors and landlords. Half the Waldenbooks stores that existed just a decade earlier no longer operated. Meanwhile, Barnes & Noble was raking in hundreds of millions of dollars yearly through their website. Borders would announce a Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing, seeking court protection and another company reorganization. According to the filing, their situation was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Borders said they could only keep 60 of the Waldenbooks stores open at most. These downsizes didn't help, so Borders Group entered Chapter 7 bankruptcy, in which it would be salvaged for all it was worth. In many cases, a company can still be resurrected from this state, but in their case, it resulted in a full company liquidation. The first of Borders' problems came immediately after they and Waldenbooks were spun off, starting as growing corporate fat and what seemed like an aversion to digital literacy. A case point in their lack of foresight was the Amazon partnership. A worldwide online retailer with exponential growth potential was not a good bedfellow for an aged bookseller. Never did they express the foresight to think what kind of a competitor they might and did make. Another one of their mistakes was the underestimation of the power behind Waldenbooks as a subsidiary and a company. They came into existence in one of the worst economic downturns in history and made steady business, went on to nail 20 years of bookselling and retail by the time of the Carter-Hawley buyout, and continued to outperform all other competition for over a decade before the Kmart buyout, reaching 60 years of existence before Borders Group for a reason. They had a lot of know-how, and were smart enough to know where to stop when it came to expansion and when it was time to turn to diversification. From the get-go, Borders was so dead set on becoming a national chain that they ended up crippling themselves. Sadly, as for Waldenbooks, their end came prematurely as a casualty in the fall of an overeager giant.